It's John. Dragons don't guard treasure the way the old stories say. But every so often, one settles onto a hoard by accident, and men come who would kill her to take it. This one comes from the cold end of Romania, and the single dragon keeper who stood between the two. The Romanian Longhorn had taken the sheep whole. All it left behind was a dark press in the snow and 3 drops of blood on a juniper root. Charlie crouched beside the mark with one glove off, feeling along the crusted edge where heat had melted the frost and let it freeze again. Bad landing, heavier on the left foreclaw than the right, and then the carcass dragged uphill beneath the trees. A healthy, nesting female would have flown with it. This one had walked. Behind him, Ilona Varga pushed through the fir branches, a coil of hide rope over one shoulder and a leather case knocking against her hip. Small she was, and broad across the back, with the steady expression of someone who had spent 20 years stitching up men who swore they'd known exactly what they were doing. "Tell me she's merely being eccentric," she said. "I have clean socks on." Charlie touched 2 fingers to the claw print. The outer groove ran deeper than the others, and where one scale had scraped loose, there was a gray smear on the ice. "She's favoring the leg. Could be a cracked talon, could be wire." Carefully he lifted the scale and held it up to the light between the trees. Along its edge lay a thin line of dried yellow paste. Whatever humor had been in Ilona's face went out of it. Drowsing salve. Cheap sort, too weak for a longhorn unless they got a barrel of it into her. He wrapped the scale in cloth and tucked it into his pocket. Strong enough to slow her, though. Strong enough to make her choose a low nest. The trail rose beyond the reserve's northern markers, past ward stones that stood half buried and hummed under the snow. At the nearest one, Charlie stopped and brushed away a crust of rime. Across the carved boundary, Rune ran a fresh cut, narrow as a knife stroke, blackened at both ends. Someone had tried to break the ward, failed, then gone through the old shepherd's gap where the enchantment thinned over bare rock. Ilona looked uphill. "How many?" "3, I think." He pointed without standing. One boot had a split heel, another was nailed with square-headed studs. The third man walked lightly but planted his staff every 4th step. "They came in yesterday afternoon. Carried weight on the way up, though not much. Nets, hooks, perhaps a crossbow. Perhaps sandwiches. Poachers never bring enough sandwiches." They followed beneath the fir line, keeping to the lee side of the ridge, so their scent would press down into the valley. Charlie moved without hurrying, setting each boot where the snow had already banked around stone or root. Longhorns saw poorly up close, compared with Hebridean blacks, but their sense of movement was sharp, and their hearing when they brooded was excellent. A snapped twig half a mile below meant nothing to them. A regular human rhythm could bring a dragon off the nest, like a falling roof. The mountain showed signs of her before she showed herself. Bark had been raked from a pine at shoulder height, 4 pale cuts brimming with amber sap. A patch of snow had sunk into a shallow basin where her belly heat rested through the night. Farther on, the air changed, carrying the mineral stink of old smoke, wet iron, and the thick animal musk that clings to nesting dragons. Ilona pulled her scarf up over her mouth. Charlie only breathed more slowly. At the edge of a narrow ravine, he found the first dropped object lying beneath a thorn bush, wrapped in oilskin and tied with copper wire. A folding iron clamp whose teeth had been filed inward to grip rather than cut. He opened it with the point of his wand and studied the yellow residue in the hinge. Fasten it round a leg, dose the dragon again once she'd tired herself. Fighting it. That was the idea. Ilona spat into the snow. They know what they are doing. They know tools. That's not the same thing. A dull crack rolled across the upper valley, and both of them dropped at once. Charlie behind a fallen trunk, Ilona against the ravine wall. No spell followed. No frightened birds lifted from the trees. Several seconds later came a second crack, deeper and farther off, then the grinding roar of snow and loose stone shifting somewhere above the clouded ridge. Charlie raised his head and watched powder rise between the peaks. Old slide face, east side of Piatra Stramba. That is outside the nesting ground. It was. The dragon's blood they found 10 minutes later, dried in a rust-colored fan across a slab of limestone, no more than a spoonful, one blackened curl where her breath had struck it. Here the tracks changed. She had stopped dragging the sheep, turned north, and climbed toward the broken mountain where no Longhorn had nested in living reserve records. Ilona knelt beside him and opened her case. Glass files, salves, bone needles, rolls of dragon hide gauze, and a pair of brass forceps long enough to look absurd in any ordinary medical room. "We go back," she said. "Fetch the handling team 2 bait sledges and the reinforced shields." Charlie stared at the slope. Above them, the female had crossed a shelf of wind-polished rock and gone from sight into a stand of crooked mountain pine. 3 sets of human tracks followed the same line, softening already under blown snow, and beside them ran a 4th trail, round, heavy marks from something dragged on a sledge. "They've brought chains," he said. The cloud shifted over the ridge, and for a moment the upper mountain stood clear. A dark shape moved against the stone, vast and low, 2 long horns sweeping back from its skull. One wing opened, ragged at the lower edge, and closed again as the dragon hauled herself into a cleft beneath the summit. Charlie rose and pulled on his glove. "You go back. Bring everyone who can climb and nobody who panics when the ground catches fire." Ilona stood as well. "And you?" He tightened the straps on his pack, checked the wind with a pinch of snow, and looked once at the broken line of the poachers' ascent. "I'm going to see why she chose that mountain." Charlie crossed the ravine on a fallen pine and climbed into country. The reserve maps marked with a polite blank. The slope tightened around him until the trees grew low and twisted, their roots gripping cracks in the limestone like old hands. He kept the ridge between himself and the dragon, moving where the wind could not carry his scent upward. Every few minutes he stopped, listened, and counted the spaces between the faint clink of metal ahead. The poachers were making poor time. Their sledge had bitten deep into the wet snow and carved 2 narrow trenches around stones and roots. One of them had slipped often enough to leave palm prints beside the trail. Another had begun dragging his right foot. On a thorn, Charlie found a strip of black wool, and 20 yards farther on, a splash of coffee where a flask had struck rock. He lifted the flask from the snow and sniffed it. "Sugar," he muttered. "Far too much." A few steps above, the tracks split. 2 men had gone on with the sledge, while the lighter walker turned west beneath an overhang. Charlie followed that trail for 30 yards and found a small iron stake driven into frozen earth. Copper thread ran from it through the scrub, almost invisible, joining a second stake beside a narrow game path. No cutting charm on the wire. It had been rubbed with drowsing salve and baited with goat fat, meant to smear the drug across the dragon's jaws or forelegs when she pushed through. Charlie crouched well back and studied how the line vanished between the bushes. Neatly built, the whole thing. But the poacher had set it for an animal that hunted by scent and hunger, and a nesting longhorn did neither in the usual way. Drawing his wand, he warmed a fist-sized stone until it steamed, wrapped the goat fat around it, rolled it beneath the wire, and flicked a dry pine cone after it. The cone struck the hidden trigger. Both stakes sprang inward, the copper line snapped tight, and a weighted net dropped from the overhang with enough force to flatten a man. He left it where it fell. Any poacher doubling back to check the trap would find his gear strewn across the path and know that someone was close behind, and that suited Charlie well enough. Nervous men watched shadows instead of their own feet, and there was plenty of bad ground ahead. Ahead, the mountain climbed into a long shoulder of bare stone. The wind had scoured the snow from its center, bearing gray slabs ribbed with old ice, though the drifts still gathered waist-deep along the margins. When Charlie set his boot to the first slab, he heard hollow water moving somewhere beneath it. Melt had opened channels between the rock and the packed snow, and it made the whole slope a lyre underfoot. The sledge marks ran straight across the middle of it. "They'll lose that," he told the empty mountainside. As if in answer, a shout came down from above, and after it the scrape of iron, the snap of a rope, a heavy sliding thump. Charlie pressed himself to the uphill rock as a wooden crate came skidding out of the cloud, spinning on one corner and burst against a boulder below him. Chain, hooks, and 3 stoppered jars scattered across the snow. One jar shattered. A pale green vapor curled out of it and hugged the ground, and the nearest scrub sagged under its own weight as it touched. He dragged his scarf up over his nose and pushed on uphill before the fumes could gather round him. Behind him, the vapor crept into a drainage channel and was gone beneath the snow. Near the top of the shoulder, the poachers had halted, and he could hear them arguing now, voices gone sharp with cold and effort. One of them wanted to abandon the sledge. Another swore the dragon would be helpless the moment the last of the drug went into the nest. A third man spoke less often and low enough that Charlie had to lean into the wind to catch it at all. Something about someone behind them. The answer came rougher and clear enough. "Let him climb, then. We'll hear him coming." Charlie looked at the hollow slabs beneath his boots and smiled without any humor in it. He slid sideways into the deeper drift, where the snow swallowed, sound whole, and started working along the edge of the slope on his knees. The crust broke under his weight, soaking his trousers and packing his boots with powder, but it gave him cover, and above him the poachers went on, waiting for footsteps that never came. The dragon announced herself with a low vibration in the stone. It reached his gloves and knees before it ever reached his ears, deep enough to set loose grit trembling in the cracks. The poachers fell silent. A second pulse followed. Then a short, hard exhalation from somewhere beyond the ridge, and at that Charlie stopped moving. It was no hunting call, no warning roar. A brooding female, made that sound when something had shifted beneath her. An egg settling against rock, perhaps, or some other object stirring in the nest. There was strain in the note, and the last of the breath had broken unevenly. He climbed harder after that, keeping low beneath the crest, and at the top found a shallow hollow, sheltered by a wall of black stone. The poachers had rested here. Boot marks, rope fibers, a bloodied rag where the man with the dragging foot had bound his ankle. Beyond it, their trail dropped away toward a narrow basin cut off from the reserve by a wall of landslide debris. The earth inside that basin had been torn open. Great slabs lay piled at drunken angles, and beneath them showed walls built by human hands. Old masonry laid bare where the mountain had split apart. Green copper roofs jutted from the scree. A broken arch still stood upright in the snow, carved with weathered stars and a pair of crossed wands. And scattered among the stones, bright even under cloud, lay coins. Some had washed out into the open in glittering fans. The rest were still packed inside the shattered walls. Silver cups, warped helmets, brass instruments, dark glass objects that gave off a faint light of their own. A stream ran through the middle of it, steaming where the dragon's heat had gone into the rock, and her tracks circled the whole exposed hoard. She had not chosen the mountain because she was hurt then. She had chosen it because the landslide had opened a place lined with metal, stone, and old enchantment, warm beneath the snow and narrow enough that a single beast could hold it. Somewhere among that buried wealth, under the great-scaled bulk of her, she had laid her eggs. Charlie lay flat behind the ridge and watched the basin through a fringe of dwarf pine. The Longhorn held the eastern end of the ruins, where a collapsed tower had left her a three-sided shelter of stone and copper beams. Only her head and shoulders showed above it, the scales along her neck a deep green brown under the cloud, each one ridged like hammered armor. She kept her left foreleg tucked tight beneath her, and every few breaths the muscles along her jaw drew hard. Across the way on the opposite slope, the poachers had stopped where they could see the coins, but not the whole of her. One raised a brass spyglass. Another crouched over the last of the jars, wrapping each in cloth. Their leader, the light-footed one with the staff, studied the basin without moving a muscle. "Where are the eggs?" the limping man asked, under her. "Then we smoke her out." The words carried clean across the hollow. Charlie put his face to the snow and breathed through his sleeve. Smoke did poorly on dragons unless you mixed it with something stronger, and fumes handled badly could set a brooding female crushing her own clutch as she tried to rise. That injured leg would only make the first movement clumsy and the second one furious. A raven lifted from the ruins and flapped low across the basin. Her head followed it at once, the horns turning with slow precision, and when the bird passed above the nest, her throat opened and a thread of flame licked through her teeth. Brief and controlled, the raven veered hard, shedding 2 black feathers, and was gone over the western wall. Charlie measured the flame in his head. Short reach, steady color, no cough in it. Her lungs were sound. The drug had slowed her limbs and left the fire untouched, which meant the poachers had misjudged the dose and were about to stand a great deal closer than sensible men ever stood. He eased back from the crest until the basin dropped out of sight. Below him, a shelf of broken rock ran round the northern wall, narrow but screened by scrub. It would bring him nearer the nest without crossing open ground, and it would carry him beneath the poacher's position into the bargain. The route began well and turned bad in a hurry. Frost had split the limestone into thin plates that slid under his boots, and old roots lay hidden beneath the snow like tripwire. He moved with his weight forward, and his wand kept holstered, for a hand reaching after magic at the wrong instant was still a hand, no longer holding the mountain. Twice he stopped to let loose stones settle before they could clatter down into the basin. Halfway along the shelf, he came on another set of tracks. Older than the poacher's trail, half filled in by wind and far smaller, a child's boot had crossed this ledge years ago, decades maybe, leaving only faint prints where some preserving charm still clung to the stone. It followed them to a crack in the cliff. Wedged beneath a slab sat a rusted tin box marked with the faded crest of the Romanian ministry, and the lid gave under his knife. Inside lay 3 moldered notebooks, a coil of silver measuring chain, and a dragon census tag stamped with a date from 1891. He worked the least damaged notebook loose and turned the pages with care. Damp had fused most of them, but a few entries held. They told of an abandoned wizarding mining hamlet, Valea Stellalore, raised over a seam of spell-sensitive ore and evacuated once the mountain began throwing off violent magical echoes. The last legible note spoke of a sealed treasury left beneath the observatory, because shifting its contents had brought on bursts of heat, false voices, and a full week of reversed gravity. Charlie looked down through the branches at the glittering basin. "Stranger things," he murmured. A boot scraped above him. He closed the notebook and pressed himself flat to the cliff as snow sifted down over the ledge. One of the poachers had come out to the rim directly overhead, close enough that Charlie could hear him breathing and the soft clatter of glass against metal. "Tracks here," the man called, "fresh." From farther off, the leader answered, wanting to know if it was the dragon. "No," came the reply. "Boots." Charlie eased a hand toward the silver measuring chain, too light for climbing, too old to trust his weight to. But the census tag on it still held a faint reserve of enchantment. He wound the chain round a loose stone, worked the tag into a crack, and flicked it downslope with his thumb. The tag hit rock somewhere below and split open with a burst of recorded sound, a dragon bellowing from the lower ravine, young and furious, and behind it the shouts of handlers who had been dead for years. On the slope above, the poacher flinched hard enough to tear his heel through the snow crust. "Below us," he shouted. All 3 of them broke toward the false call, boots thudding careless across the ridge, and one of the wrapped jars cracked against stone as they went. Charlie counted their voices shifting east before he crawled out from under the shelf and worked his way on around the basin. The Longhorn had lifted her head again, and this time her eyes came to rest directly on him. He stopped behind a broken wall, hidden from the poacher still, but no longer hidden from her. She drew the air in through her nostrils, tasting him across the ruins, and her eyes thinned to bronze slits while the scales behind her horns rose one after another. Charlie eased the pack from his shoulders and set it on the ground. He turned a shoulder toward her, dropped his head, kept both hands out where she could see them, Head on, a dragon rid you as a threat. Offer it your flank and refuse to stare, and you were asking instead for permission to go on living. Her chest swelled. Heat came through the ruined wall ahead of the flame, tightening the skin across his face, drying his lips, warming the wet wool at his knees. He held still and breathed as little as he could while a low growl rolled out over the basin and set the ancient coins trembling. Several long seconds passed before her jaws closed again. Smoke streamed from one nostril and drifted across the nest. She had not accepted him. She had only decided not to burn him yet. For a first introduction, Charlie called that practically friendly. He stayed where he was until she let her head drop an inch, which was enough. One knee back, then the other. His body still turned, and his gaze kept below the line of her horns. Because a dragon remembered anything you did while it was still making up its mind about killing you, and sudden relief moved as suddenly as anything else. The shelter at his back had been a workshop once. Half a stone roof clung on, held by a beam gone green with copper rot, and the floor was strewn with cracked crucibles and blackened lengths of chain. Charlie slid inside and settled where a gap in the masonry gave him the nest. Smoke trailed from the dragon's nostrils in two thin streams as she watched him go. Closer to her, injury told its story more plainly. A loop of dark wire had bitten into the joint above her left foreclaw and vanished beneath the overlapping scales, and every time she shifted her weight, it dragged against swollen flesh. Someone had worked drowsing salve into the twist where the heat of her body would keep it soft and doing its work. Charlie's mouth went thin. Catch wire got used on young dragons that had to be moved off farms or out of villages, but reserve wire was broad, charmed to give under strain, checked every few minutes. This was fencing cable with a tightening hex laid over the top of it. The harder she fought, the deeper it went. Beyond the nest, the poachers had come back to the western rim. Their false alarm had cost them time and a good deal of dignity, and the limping one had stopped bothering to keep his voice down. There was nothing below, he said. Someone's playing with us. Then stop announcing where we are, the leader said. The third man, broad under a fox fur cap, set one of the remaining jars down on the snow. He wore square-nailed boots and stood with his feet planted too wide, as if every slope were a tavern floor. Glass breaks, he reckoned. The beast sleeps, they take what they can carry, and they might as well throw from here. Before he could get the cork out, the leader knocked the jar from his hand. It landed in the snow without breaking. The fumes sink, he said. The nest's lower than us, and so's the gold. Put her down too hard and she falls across the entrance. Charlie looked back down at the basin. This one understood gas and gravity, both which made him the worst of the three. And yet he still talked about the dragon, the way you'd talk about a fallen beam, something to be shifted before the real work started. That kind of error usually lasted right up until the first flame. A low scraping came from the nest. The Longhorn raised the injured leg and set it down again, claws spreading over a bed of silver plate and melted coin, and for a moment, under her belly, Charlie caught the pale curve of an egg, then a second, each larger than a beer barrel and flecked with dark green. She'd built the clutch bed with care. Gold and silver carried her heat down through the lower layers. Broken pottery and charred timber insulated the edges. Thick copper strips had been dragged into a ring around the eggs, their old enchantments holding the warmth. Long after her body had moved away, what looked like greed at a distance was close-up, sound nesting craft. Something else lay under the copper, a wheel of black glass, no wider than a dinner plate, turned slowly on its own power, tiny points of light drifting inside it like stars seen through deep water, and each full rotation sent a faint tremor out through the coins around it. The Longhorn felt it as well. Her head lifted at every vibration, and her body drew tighter about the clutch. The tremors were slight, but an injured dragon could take repeated movement beneath its nest for hatching or burrowing or attack. There, Charlie thought, was the broken warning call he'd heard from the ridge. He opened his pack. Out came a roll of smoked goatskin, 2 lengths of ash wood, a small tin of rendered sheep fat, none of which would get the wire off her. What it might do was let him close the distance far enough to see whether getting it off was possible at all. The goatskin carried the smell of an old feeding station, strong enough to be recognized without waking hunger. Charlie rubbed fat down the ash wood, warmed it gently with his wand until the scent climbed through the workshop, then laid 1 stick in the doorway and slid the second out into the open, several yards short of the nest. Her nostrils widened. Her eyes went from Charlie to the stick and back to Charlie, and though she did not move, the scales along her throat lay flatter against one another. He waited out 3 slow breaths of hers. "That's right," he said quietly. "Nothing clever?" A shout went up from the western rim. The broad man had found the sprung net on the lower path and was brandishing a torn strip of goat fat. The leader's gaze swung across the basin, tracing the routes a body might have taken, and came to rest on the ruined workshop. Charlie lowered himself behind the wall as the brass spyglass came up. For a few seconds, nothing in the basin moved but the Longhorn's breathing. Then the black glass wheel beneath her nest turned over once more, and the buried ruins answered it. A deep metallic note that rolled clean through the mountain. Coins slid under the dragon's weight. Behind her, a section of old wall cracked open on a narrow stair, descending beneath the nest, and warm golden light climbed the steps, while every poacher on the ridge fell silent. The light under the nest had none of the flicker of flame. It rose steady through the opened stair, catching along the edges of the coins, turning the Longhorn's lower scales the color of old bronze. She moved at once, hauling the injured foreleg in closer beneath her chest, and the wire drew tight with a faint metallic creak. Charlie pressed a palm flat to the workshop floor. A vibration came up through the stone in slow, even beats, each one chased by the turning click of the black glass wheel. Whatever lay below had started moving the moment the wall gave. The dragon caught the rhythm through her clutch and answered it with a low, uncertain rumble. Across the basin, the broad poacher laughed. "Treasury door?" "Quiet," said the leader. "There's enough down there to buy the reserve. There may be enough down there to drop the reserve into the valley." The limping man had his spyglass out again. The beast was sitting right over the entrance, he said. They should use the jars now while she was confused. Charlie's eyes moved from the men to the dragon. Her pupils had gone wide and the plates along her back were lifting in ragged rows. A settled Longhorn warned you in stages: head, throat, shoulders, then wings. This one had skipped the first two and gone straight to readying her body for the strike. He reached into his pack and found a short iron rod wrapped in red cloth. Reserve handlers called it a thunder pin, though it made no thunder. Driven into rock and woken with a wand, it sent a deep pulse through the ground, useful for turning dragons away from unstable caves or hidden roads. Used near eggs, it could provoke exactly the wrong response. Charlie set it beside his knee anyway. There were few good tools in a bad position, only tools whose risks had been counted. If the poachers threw their drug, he might need to pull the dragon's attention towards solid ground before she collapsed across the clutch. The black wheel clicked again, and from the stair came a whisper of many voices speaking over one another, too faint for words but shaped like conversation, heard through a wall. The Longhorn jerked her head toward the opening and snapped at empty air. The whispering stopped. For 3 breaths the basin held still. Then a silver cup rolled from beneath her flank and chimed against a stone, and she struck it with one claw, flattening it like foil. Magical echoes, Charlie murmured, remembering the notebook. Heat, voices, reversed gravity. The old miners had not sealed the treasury to keep thieves out. They had sealed it because the things inside did not behave properly when disturbed. A wrapped jar sailed from the western ridge. Charlie saw the broad man's arm complete the throw before he saw the glass itself, turning end over end above the basin. He moved without drawing his wand. One hand seized the thunder pin, the other a loose piece of roof slate, and he hurled the slate hard across the jar's path. The edge caught the cloth wrapping. The jar veered, hit the broken arch, and burst high above the ruins. Green vapor poured down the stones. The Longhorn surged upright, her left foreleg folded, and her shoulder crashed into the copper ring around the nest. One egg rolled half a turn against a bed of silver plates. Flame burst from her jaws in a wide orange sheet that scorched the arch and sent the vapor boiling upward. Charlie drove the thunder pin into a crack in the workshop floor, struck its head with the butt of his wand, and released one controlled pulse toward the open northern slope. The rock beneath the dragon trembled once, stronger away from the nest than beneath it, and her head whipped toward the pulse. "Come on," Charlie said under his breath. "Solid ground. That's all it is." The dragon dragged herself 1 pace north, away from the fumes and the unstable stair. Her good foreclaw crushed a brass instrument underfoot. The injured leg followed badly, wire cutting deeper as she moved, but the egg settled back into its hollow. On the ridge, the leader rounded on the broad man. "I said wait. It nearly worked." It nearly buried the door. The dragon answered them with a roar that struck the walls and came back doubled. Snow dropped from the upper ledges. The broad man stepped away from the rim while the limping one crouched and covered his head. Charlie used the noise to leave the workshop, moving bent low along the inner wall, keeping broken masonry between himself and the poachers. She had turned broadside to him, her attention fixed west, and the wire around her leg was fully visible now. It ran to a short length of chain buried beneath the scales, ending in a barbed clasp stamped with a tiny maker's mark, and he recognized it from confiscated gear in the reserve stores. The clasp had been designed for mine trolls, strong enough to hold under twisting force, and charmed to contract when heated. Dragonfire had been tightening it all along. He stopped behind the remains of a chimney, close enough to smell scorched hide and the sour sweetness of the salve. The flesh around the wire had swollen dark red. Removing it would take both hands, a cutting charm held steady, and several seconds within reach of her claws. A glint below the dragon caught his eye. The movement had uncovered a narrow ledge beside the open stair, where a gold object rested among broken tiles. Shaped like a compass, it had 7 needles, all pointing in different directions, and one had swung toward Charlie and begun tapping urgently against the glass. Words appeared around its rim. Ministry distress, relay, turn once to summon. Charlie stared at it. A working relay from the old settlement could call ministry responders through the mountain wards, perhaps within minutes. It could bring handlers, healers, and enough force to close the basin before the poachers reached the nest. It could also be lifted with one careful axio from where he crouched. The 7 needles spun faster. The Longhorn lowered her chest over the eggs again, pinning the relay beneath the edge of her injured leg, and around it the copper nesting ring shifted and began to sag toward the opened stair, taking the device would pull the support loose. Charlie watched one egg rock gently against the metal, then he slid his wand back into its holster, took out his cutting pliers, and began working his way toward the dragon. The last 20 feet to the nest took him longer than the whole climb from the ravine. He advanced only when the Longhorn breathed out, using the rush of smoke and the scrape of her scales to cover each movement. One knee went down among hot coins, then one hand, then the other. The metal pressed through his gloves like stones left beside a fire. Close to the dragon, every detail became enormous. The horn above her left eye was longer than his arm and chipped near the tip from some old fight. Ash had gathered in the grooves of her throat scales, a pale, thick scar across the soft hide behind her jaw, and tiny red mites moved between the plates along her shoulder. The wire lay 6 feet ahead. Charlie set the pliers on the coins and opened a narrow pouch at his belt. From it he took powdered mooncalf horn, a square of raw hide, and a stoppered phial of cold blue salve. The powder would dull the tightening hex for perhaps half a minute. The hide would keep the cut wire from springing into flesh. The salve was meant for burns, though it worked well enough on anything swollen and angry. Above the western rim, the poachers had begun moving again, their boots crunching along the ridge in a slow arc toward the basin's southern end. The leader had understood that throwing jars from above would not shift the dragon safely, so he was searching for another approach. Charlie heard the broad man mutter, "There, by the chimney." A spell struck the stone behind him and burst it into pale chips. The Longhorn's head snapped round, and Charlie flattened himself over the coins as heat rolled across his back. Her gaze passed over him and fixed on the western wall, where the poacher had already dropped out of sight. "Excellent," Charlie whispered into the metal. "Now she knows precisely where everyone is." Another spell cracked against the ruins, this one lower and farther south. The leader was trying to draw the dragon's attention away from the nest, while his companions descended elsewhere. It might have worked on a hungry male defending territory. The female on eggs did not chase noise unless the noise entered the clutch circle. Charlie pushed the raw hide beneath the wire and dusted the clasp with mooncalf horn. The powder hissed where it touched the heated metal. For an instant, the tightening charm showed itself as a thin red glow running through the cable and vanishing under the dragon's scales. Her leg twitched. Charlie stopped with one hand resting beside the swollen joint. The Longhorn turned her head until one bronze eye looked down at him. Smoke leaked through her teeth, carrying the bitter smell of the drug and the rank heat of half-digested mutton. "Easy," he said. His voice came out lower than usual. "You know I'm here." The dragon opened her jaws slightly. Charlie shifted his weight away from the eggs and lowered his head. He did not reach for his wand. The pliers stayed on the coins between them, plain iron without a bright edge or magical shine. For several seconds, nothing moved, except the 7 needles beneath her foreleg, tapping against the distress relay's glass in a frantic little rhythm. One turn would bring help. One pull would drag the copper support from beneath the nearest egg. Charlie pushed the relay deeper under a fold of shed scale. The dragon watched his hand disappear beside her leg. Her throat vibrated, but she did not strike. When he withdrew, he held only a loose strip of charred leather that had been caught beneath the wire. "Good choice," he murmured, though he couldn't have said whether he meant her decision or his own. A rope dropped over the southern wall. The limping poacher came first, lowering himself in awkward stages with one boot braced against the masonry, a hooked pole slung across his back, and a small crossbow riding at his hip. Behind him came the broad man, the last 2 jars bundled against his chest. Neither of them looked twice at the shadow beneath the dragon's shoulder, and so neither of them saw Charlie there. The Longhorn had. He took the pliers in both hands, fitted their jaws around the wire, and squeezed. Mooncalf powder had dimmed the charm, but the cable fought back with a hard, living tension, and he had to squeeze again and again until his wrists shook and the wire finally snapped. One end whipped across his cheek and opened the skin. The other sprang up beneath the raw hide, which caught the barb before it could tear deeper into her leg. But the dragon reared anyway, roaring, flinging Charlie sideways across the hoard, while coins and silver plates went cascading toward the open stair, and the nearest egg began to roll. He landed on one shoulder. Somewhere in the fall, his hand found the sagging copper ring, and he jammed both boots against a fallen beam. The weight still dragged him half a yard over the hot metal, his gloves smoking, something in his left side giving a sharp, ugly crack. The egg came to rest against his forearm and stopped. Above him, the Longhorn came down on 3 legs, wings spread across the ruins. Her freed foreclaw opened and closed once, flinging off the last of the broken wire, and then her head swung toward the 2 poachers in the basin. They had reached the treasure. They had also reached the dragon. The broad man froze with both jars pressed to his chest. Behind him, the limping one still had a hand on the rope and a boot against the wall. Nobody spoke. She stood over the nest with the freed claw spread wide, blood running between 2 scales and steaming where it touched the coins. Charlie kept his forearm braced against the egg until the copper ring settled. Pain pulsed under his ribs, bright enough to blur the edges of the ruins, and he let out one breath through his teeth, shifted his grip, and wedged a broken silver tray beneath the egg's lower curve. The tray bent. It held. "Back up," he said. The broad man's head snapped down. "Where did you come from?" "Back up slowly." Her head tracked the sound of Charlie's voice, then went back to the stranger's, jaw parting by a finger's width, a red glow moving deep in her throat. The limping man let go of the rope and lifted both hands. "We can leave." His companion was looking at the gold spilled around his boots, coins carpeting the ground in every direction, old galleons among stamped Romanian crowns and heavy discs Charlie didn't recognize. A jeweled coffer split open beside the stair, with its contents scattered in the heat. What held the broad man's eye was a fist-sized blue stone lying among them. "Leave it," Charlie said. The man bent for it anyway. Charlie snatched a brass plate off the hoard and flung it past his shoulder. It struck the wall with a sharp clang, and the flame followed the noise, crossing the space between the poachers in a flat orange stream and bursting against the stone. Both men threw themselves flat. One of the wrapped jars shattered under the broad man's weight, green liquid spilling into the snow and dust. Vapor spread around his coat, and his movements went slow all at once, as though the ground had reached up and taken hold of him. The Longhorn stepped forward. Her injured foreleg trembled, but the claw bore weight now, and Charlie watched the change run through her shoulders as she tested it, shifting from defense into the first motion of a charge. The basin was too small for her to build any speed, which would only make the attack clumsier, harder to turn aside. He got upright with one hand against the copper ring. "Heads down," he said. "Do not run." "She'll burn us," the limping man said, staring at him. "She'll burn whatever moves first." The broad poacher tried to rise. Drug vapor curled up off his coat, and one arm folded under him, his boot scraping a fan of coins toward the stair, and below the nest, the black wheel clicked round another quarter turn. Gravity loosened. Charlie felt it first in his stomach. Dust lifted off the floor, and after it came flakes of rust, loose feathers, half a dozen small coins. The broad man rose several inches without meaning to, and started sliding sideways through the air, too drugged to work out why. The Longhorn recoiled from the drifting metal, her wings striking the broken tower and bringing masonry down across the basin. One falling block cut the poachers off from the rope, another smashed through the old workshop roof, and the whole mountain gave a slow groan beneath them. He grabbed the thunder pin from where it had rolled among the coins, struck it once against the floor, and sent a low pulse toward the northern spillway. The vibration ran through the basin, rattling the loose treasure, pulling the dragon's attention off the airborne man. "Crawl north," he told the limping poacher. "Keep below her shoulder. Take your friend by the collar and crawl." The man hesitated just long enough to glance at the gold around his knees. Then a silver cup drifted past his face and turned itself upside down in the air, and that settled it. He took a fistful of the broad man's coat and dragged him across the broken floor, both of them low beneath the Longhorn's line of sight. Charlie went with them, one hand clamped to his side. He didn't lead them toward the main path. That route crossed open ground beneath the nest and ended at the cliff, where the dragon could follow. Instead, he steered them into a narrow channel that meltwater had cut along the northern wall, where sulfur steamed from cracks under the snow. its smell strong enough to blunt her sense of scent. The channel was too tight for her shoulders and far too unstable to stand upright in. At the entrance, the limping man looked back toward the hoard. The bluestone still lay beside the broken coffer, glowing softly through the dust, and his hand went toward the pouch at his belt. Charlie caught his wrist. "Take it and she follows. She can't fit. She can tear the channel open." Behind them, the Longhorn roared, and the old walls answered from 3 directions, which ended the discussion. The poacher hauled his companion into the sulfur passage, and Charlie turned back toward the nest. High on the western rim, the leader stood alone. He had watched the whole retreat without throwing a single spell. Now he lowered his spyglass and studied the cracks running through the basin walls. "Your mountain is coming apart," he called. Charlie wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his glove. "Then I'd choose where I stood." The leader looked once at the dragon, once at the open treasury, and started moving toward higher ground. Charlie waited until the 2 men had disappeared into the sulfur channel before he turned back to the nest. The loosened gravity was fading now, dropping coins and tools in an uneven shower across the ruins. A brass helmet struck the ground beside him and rolled into the open stair, and from below came a deep clang, and then another pulse through the stone. The Longhorn had drawn back over her eggs, her freed foreleg resting awkwardly on the copper ring, blood dark on the scales above the joint. She kept her eyes on the stair, where golden light was climbing in slow bands, as though something under the mountain had begun to breathe. He came at her from the injured side. A dragon can turn its head faster than most men can draw a wand, but a damaged leg limits how fast the body swings round behind it, so he set each boot down on broad pieces of metal rather than loose coin and kept his shoulders low. Bending sharpened the pain beneath his ribs, and after a while he gave up trying to breathe deeply at all. At 10 feet, the Longhorn showed him her teeth. "I know," Charlie said. "Busy morning." He held up the blue salve and thumbed the stopper loose. The smell came off it sharp and clean, mint crushed into wet clay. Dragons dislike it and only put up with the cold after a wire wound because it dulls the burn the tightening charms leave behind. And tolerance on a good day meant the handler kept most of his fingers. A stone shifted on the western ridge. The poacher leader had climbed above the basin to a narrow shelf overlooking the open treasury, carrying no jars now and leaving the staff behind, using both hands for the rock. His route kept him clear of the dragon's direct sight and brought him closer to the broken arch above Charlie. Charlie glanced once at the slope. The man had learned to choose firm rock and test each hold before he trusted it. Something from the mountain which was inconvenient. The Longhorn struck the ground with her good foreclaw, and coins leapt around Charlie's boots, while the nearest egg gave a small answering knock from inside its shell. She twisted at once, lowering her head to the sound. He used the moment. Sliding the square of raw hide away from the wound, he caught the loose wire end with the pliers and pulled it clear. A strip of scale came with it, then a hot rush of blood. Her tail hit him before he could move. It caught his pack rather than his spine, tore one strap, and flung him into a bank of old shields. Metal folded under his shoulder. With with a noise like a cupboard collapsing. Half the salve had spilled across his sleeve, but the phial stayed in his hand. He lay still. The Longhorn turned her head towards him, nostrils wide. Setting the phial down, he dipped 2 fingers into what remained of the salve and rubbed it across the back of his own glove, then held the cold, scented hand where she could smell it. Her throat rumbled. "Same stuff," Charlie said, "only less hide involved." No flame came. After several breaths, he crawled forward again and pressed the salve around the swollen joint, working with the direction of the scales. Her claws dug grooves through a silver platter, but she kept the leg down, and cold vapor curled around his fingers as the medicine spread. Above them, the leader reached the broken arch. Charlie saw his shadow cross the gold-lit floor before the man himself appeared. And then a rope uncoiled silently from the arch and dropped towards the stair, its end fitted with a 3-pronged hook. The poacher lowered it past the Longhorn's tail, aiming for the jeweled coffer near the opening. His first cast caught only coins. They rose in a glittering stream, clattering against the stone and turning the dragon's head, and the leader froze, holding the rope against his chest while she searched for the source. Charlie kept one hand against her leg. "Do that again," he called, "and she'll bring the arch down with you on it." The leader looked over the edge and told him he was in a poor position to advise anyone. "Mine has a dragon beside it." The poacher's mouth tightened. He shifted the hook towards the coffer anyway. Charlie reached for neither wand nor stone. Instead, he picked up the severed catch wire and laid its barbed end across the nearest copper strip, old metal that still carried heat from the nest. As the wire warmed, the tightening charm flared red and contracted around the strip with a sharp metallic snap. The Longhorn recognized the sound. Her head whipped towards the arch, and flame struck the masonry below the leader, flash heating the snow packed into its cracks. Steam burst outward. The poacher threw himself onto the upper shelf as the arch split down the middle and folded into the basin. He escaped the falling stone. His rope did not. The hook vanished beneath the rubble, dragging the jeweled coffer sideways and spilling its contents deeper into the treasury stair, and the golden light below brightened at once. A tremor passed through the basin. This one did not stop. Charlie felt the old walls begin to move around them, each settling stone pressing the next. The northern channel spat a cloud of sulfur and frightened shouting. High above, a cornice of snow cracked away from the ridge and slid across the leader's chosen route, sealing him on the wrong side of the mountain. The Longhorn spread one wing over the eggs. Charlie rose carefully beside her, one hand pressed to his ribs and the other resting near the treated leg. A line of loose rock had opened along the eastern wall, leading out of the basin towards a shelf of solid black stone. Wide enough for the dragon, but the clutch could not be moved, and the nest floor was beginning to tilt towards the stair. He looked at the copper ring, the buried distress relay, and the eggs settling against their bed of ancient gold. Then he began dragging fallen beams into place, building a brace beneath the treasure before the mountain could take it all. The first beam slipped twice before he found stone solid enough to hold it. He drove one end beneath the sagging copper ring and wedged the other against the remains of the observatory wall. Half burnt and older than anyone living at the reserve, the timber had kept its core through some stubborn spell in the wood. When the nest shifted again, the beam bowed and stayed in place. The Longhorn watched him from above the eggs, her injured leg trembling under her weight, though the cold salve had slowed the bleeding. Each time he dragged another piece of timber close, she lowered her head and breathed across it, testing scent and heat. By the third beam, his sleeves were smoking at the cuffs. "Those are staying," he told her. "You may burn the next thing I bring." A crack opened through the center of the basin. It ran between scattered piles of gold, split a marble floor tile, and reached the lip of the treasury stair with a noise like cloth tearing. Several coins dropped into the darkness below, and a moment later they returned, floating upwards in a slow spinning column. Charlie stepped away. The reversed gravity was strengthening near the stair, lifting lighter objects first and tugging at the tails of his coat. A silver candlestick rose past his shoulder, struck the Longhorn's wing, and was flattened against the wall by one irritated sweep. Her movement dislodged a section of copper ring. The nearest egg rolled against the bracing beam and stopped with a hollow knock, and from inside came a faint scrape, then silence. He knelt beside it and placed one gloved palm against the shell. Warmth pulsed through the dark green flecks, steady and deep, and the scrape came again, low on the far side, where the hatchling had shifted beneath the thick inner membrane. "Still cooking," Charlie said. From the northern channel came the broad poacher's groan and the limping man's strained reply. They were trying to climb out through the sulfur passage, but the tremor had dropped stones across its lower bend, and their voices rose and fell under the earth, close enough to hear and too far away for him to reach without leaving the nest. Above the western shelf, the leader called down that they were trapped. "I noticed. You cannot hold that floor and dig them out." Charlie dragged a fourth beam across the coins. "Then you'd better start from your side." The man looked towards the sealed route behind him. Snow and shattered stone blocked the way back, but a narrow chimney climbed above the shelf towards open ground. Steep, exposed, and bare of anything a sensible climber would call a proper hold. He said he had no rope. "You had one." The answer earned Charlie a long stare. Then the leader removed his coat, tore it into broad strips, and began knotting them together with the lining of his pack. He anchored the makeshift rope around a stone spur and lowered himself towards the northern channel. Charlie turned back to the nest. The Longhorn had begun scraping at the cracked floor with her good claw, trying to pull metal towards the eggs. Instinct told her to rebuild the ring, but each stroke sent more coins sliding into the stair and increased the pull beneath them. He stepped between her claw and the opening. The dragon drew herself up. Even injured and cramped beneath the broken tower, she filled his sight with horn, scale, and the furnace glow behind her teeth, and the heat pressed against his face, hard enough to sting the cut on his cheek. Charlie lifted both empty hands. "That way is gone." Her tail struck the wall beside him. Stone burst across his back. One knee folded under the blow, and he caught himself on the bracing beam, tasting blood where he had bitten his tongue. She scraped forward again. He seized a scorched shield and shoved it across the crack, added a second, then kicked a spill of coins over their edges until the gap disappeared beneath metal. The dragon struck the false floor once, heard the hollow answer, and pulled her claw back. A deep groan traveled through the treasury. The black glass wheel rose from beneath the nest, lifted by the changing gravity, and floated into open air, its 7 dark spokes turning around a center full of moving stars, while the whispering voices returned from below. The Longhorn snapped at it. Her teeth closed on empty space as the wheel drifted higher. The sudden twist wrenched her injured legs sideways and slammed her into the copper ring. Charlie got both arms around the nearest egg, but the impact drove him back over the beam and sent pain tearing through his ribs. Then the wheel struck the underside of the broken roof, and every star inside it flared white. For one breath, the whole basin went weightless. Charlie rose from the ground with the egg pressed against his chest, coins lifting around him in shining sheets. The Longhorn's wings opened on instinct, beating at walls that no longer gave her purchase, and all about them beams, shields, and fragments of the old settlement turned slowly through the air. "Easy," he gasped, though nothing in the basin was listening. He hooked one elbow around the bracing beam as it began to rise, its lower end still held to the wall, pinned by the old preserving charm. One fixed point in a world that had forgotten which way was down, and with his free arm he guided the egg back towards the dragon's belly. Her injured claw opened above him. He pushed the shell into the cradle of her forelegs, and for an instant dragon and handler hung together among the floating treasure, her bronze eye level with his face. Then the black wheel completed its turn, gravity returned, and the mountain dropped everything at once. Charlie hit the nest floor on one shoulder and slid beneath a rain of coins. The egg came down against the copper ring with a heavy thud, cushioned by the dragon's forelegs in a layer of collapsed silverware. A beam struck the stone beside his head and split lengthwise. For several seconds there was nothing but falling metal, broken masonry, and the beating of the Longhorn's wings. When the noise eased, he opened his eyes. Dust coated his tongue. His left arm had gone numb from elbow to fingertips, and the pain under his ribs had spread across his back, making each breath shallow and careful. He pushed himself onto one knee and looked first at the eggs. All 3 were still together. The nearest had gained a pale scrape across its shell, but no crack. Curled around them, chest heaving, the Longhorn draped one wing over the clutch, while loose gold slid down her back in bright streams. Near the stair, the black glass wheel lay broken, its spokes shattered into blunt, glossy pieces, the lights inside them going out one by one, with each fading point. The strange pull beneath the ruins weakened. The whispering voices dwindled to a murmur, then to nothing. Charlie picked up a shard with his good hand. A tiny map of stars moved beneath the surface, slower now, as though seen through ice. He set it back among the hoard and covered it with a bent shield. Off on the northern side of the basin, stone scraped against stone. The leader had reached the blocked sulfur channel and was digging with the head of a broken climbing staff, his coat rope running down from the shelf behind him, frayed but holding. "Can they breathe?" Charlie called. "One is shouting," the man replied. "The other is snoring." "Snoring is breathing." That is an optimistic medical standard. It's the one we use before breakfast. A muffled curse rose from inside the passage, then coughing. The limping poacher pushed loose gravel through a narrow gap, and a gloved hand appeared between two rocks. The leader widened the opening by inches, working without magic because the channel walls were veined with sulfur and old enchantment. Charlie glanced towards the Longhorn. Her eyes stayed fixed on the digging, though the smell from the vents muddied the men's scent. She could not reach them through the narrow cut, but another collapse might open the whole side of the basin. He gathered the remaining smoked goatskin from his pack. Most of it had been torn. One edge had caught fire, yet the reserve scent still clung to it. He dragged it east across the ruins, laying a trail away from the northern channel and towards the broad shelf of black stone. The Longhorn followed the movement with her head. Beyond the broken wall, Charlie set down the goatskin, added a strip of bloody wire beside it, and struck the thunder pin once, softly, sending a pulse through the eastern shelf. Feeding scent, injury scent, firm ground. The combination offered a familiar pattern. Her nostrils widened. She shifted her good foreclaw towards the shelf, then stopped when the eggs moved beneath her. "That's right," Charlie said. "Stay with them." The handling was no longer about making her leave. It was about giving her somewhere safe to send her fear while the men got out. Each time the northern stone shifted, he repeated the low pulse eastward, keeping the vibration steady and far from the clutch. The leader freed the limping man first. He came through the gap on his stomach, face gray beneath the dirt, one trouser leg soaked from the broken jars, and rolled into the channel where he lay coughing, both hands empty. "Your friend?" Charlie said. The man nodded, reached back into the hole, and together he and the leader dragged the broad poacher through by his shoulders. The drowsing vapor had left him heavy and slow, his fur cap missing, one eyebrow singed away. Then the Longhorn saw them emerge. Her wing lifted, fire brightened behind her teeth, and the copper ring groaned as she gathered her legs beneath her. Charlie struck the thunder pin hard, and the eastern shelf answered with a deep boom. At the same moment, a load of snow broke free above it and crashed onto the black stone in a wide white sheet. The Longhorn wheeled towards the movement, roaring into the empty slope. "Now!" Charlie shouted. The three poachers crawled down the sulfur channel while the dragon's flame tore across the falling snow. Steam swallowed the eastern wall, thick and white, hiding the men as they vanished between the rocks. Charlie stayed beside the nest, one hand against the bent copper ring. Through the steam came the Longhorn's huge shadow, wings raised and horns lowered. When she turned back, no poacher remained in sight. Only Charlie stood within the clutch circle. She approached with slow, uneven steps, blood darkening her treated leg and melted snow running from her jaws, and stopped close enough that the heat of her breath lifted the hair from his forehead. He lowered his head and did not move. She sniffed the cut on his cheek, the salve on his gloves, the dragon blood dried across his sleeve. Then she reached past him, closed her teeth around the thunder pin, and crushed it into 3 pieces. The broken pieces fell between his boots. One still gave a weak metallic hum until the Longhorn grounded under her foreclaw, and the sound stopped. She watched him the whole time, as if making the terms of their arrangement clear. Charlie gave the crushed iron a brief glance. Fair enough. The steam thinned across the eastern shelf. Beyond it, the snow had settled into a rough white ramp over black stone, and nothing moved in the sulfur channel. The poachers had taken the only route the mountain still allowed, downhill through a maze of vents, loose gullies, and old pine scrub. They would not move quickly. The broad man was half drugged. The second could barely use one leg, and their leader had given up his coat and most of his rope, none of which made Charlie trust them to keep going. He backed away from the Longhorn one step at a time. Her head followed, but the scales along her throat stayed flat. At the broken workshop wall, he took the last strip of smoked hide from his pack and laid it beside the nest. The dragon sniffed it, then pulled it beneath her chest with one hooked claw. That cost the reserve 6 sickles, Charlie said. Try not to lose it. A sound came from the nearest egg, 3 quick taps, and then a scrape. At once the Longhorn lowered her head and turned the shell with the inside of her wrist, moving it clear of the damaged copper ring. For all the size of the claw, her touch was precise. Each talon held clear. Charlie watched the treated foreleg take part of her weight. The joint was still swollen, but the tension had gone out of her shoulder. She would need proper cleaning before infection set in, perhaps a strengthening draft, fed inside a goat carcass if she refused closer handling. That work required Ilona, Shields, and several people who knew when silence was more useful than courage. He reached the northern channel to find a trail of churned sulfur mud descending between the rocks. One set of handprints ran deep and dragging. Another wandered against the wall, wherever the limping man had lost his balance. Through all of it, the leader's prints stayed steady. Charlie followed far enough to reach the first vent field, where warm air hissed from yellow-crusted cracks, melting tunnels beneath the snow and leaving thin roofs over boiling mud. Reserve workers crossed such ground with poles and long spacing between their steps. The poachers had bunched together. A section of crust had broken beneath the broad man, dropping one leg into a shallow vent, and his companions had hauled him free, leaving a fur-lined boot wedged in the mud and a long scrape where all 3 had gone over backwards. From there, their tracks angled towards what looked like level ground. Charlie took a shorter route along exposed stone and reached the far side ahead of them. Behind a curtain of steam, he stood and listened to their approach. Labored breathing, the scrape of the climbing staff, and the broad man complaining that his foot had gone numb. "It is bare in the snow," said the limping man. "Of course it has." 10 yards from the crusted hollow, the leader stopped them. This was wrong, he said, and Charlie held still while the man crouched and pushed the staff into the snow ahead. It broke through at once, releasing a burst of hot vapor and brown water, and the broad poacher swore and lurched backwards. "We go around," the leader said. "To where?" asked the limping man. The steam shifted, and there was Charlie on the rock shelf. No wand in his hand, his left arm hanging stiffly, dried blood run from his cheek into the collar of his coat. "Follow the blue stakes," he told them. The broad man stared. "There were no stakes," he said, and Charlie pointed with his chin. Farther down the slope, old reserve markers stood half buried among the pines, painted blue on the valley side and red towards the vents. From above, only the red faces showed. "The blue side marks safe ground," Charlie said. "To see it, you have to pass below each stake before choosing the next." The leader studied the slope, then Charlie, and asked what happened if they chose the wrong one. "You'll know for a moment." The broad man reached for his wand. His fingers were clumsy from the vapor, and the wand slipped once against his coat, and before he could lift it, the snow beneath his remaining boot gave a soft, hollow sigh. Charlie stepped back onto firmer rock. All three poachers went very still. A crack ran around the broad man's heel, thin and dark. The leader caught his collar, the limping man seized his belt, and together they eased him sideways, an inch at a time. The crust held until his weight reached stone, then collapsed into a steaming hole. No one drew a wand after that. Charlie walked to the safe line several yards above them, never close enough to be grabbed, and never far enough for them to guess at the route. At each marker he waited until they had reached the blue face before moving on towards the next. The mountain took their remaining gear piece by piece. A bundle of chain slipped from the limping man's shoulder and was gone into a vent. The crossbow snagged in dwarf pine and stayed behind when its strap tore. One pack split open on a steep traverse, scattering empty coin sacks down a gully where they fluttered like dirty flags. By the time the first reserve watchtower showed through the trees, the poachers carried nothing from the basin. The leader had one arm beneath the broad man's shoulder. The limping man leaned on the broken staff, his face pinched white with every step. Charlie stopped at the edge of the ward line. Beyond it, bells were ringing from the lower station, and figures moved between the pines with shield frames, medical cases, and two bait sledges pulled by broad-chested mountain ponies. Ilona came first, climbing faster than the handlers behind her, taking in Charlie's torn coat, hanging arm, and guarded breathing without breaking stride. "You look dreadful," she said. Charlie nodded towards the three men. "They look worse." She passed him and opened her medical case. Behind her, the reserve handlers spread across the boundary path, wands, low, dragon-hide shields resting against their legs. Once, the poacher leader looked back towards the mountain, where high above the basin, a green-brown wing rose through the thinning steam and folded again over the hidden nest. Ilona took Charlie by the jaw and turned his face towards the light, her thumb stopping just below the cut on his cheek, where dried blood had glued a strand of red hair to the skin. "How many bones?" she asked. "One, perhaps two." That was not the question. He drew a careful breath and failed to hide the catch in it. Ilona shut her eyes a moment, then pointed at a flat stone beside the ward marker. "Sit down before I make the mountain do it for me." Charlie sat. Around them, the reserve handlers secured the poachers with plain iron wrist loops and took their wands without ceremony. Nobody cheered, and nobody asked whether the men had found treasure. They laid the broad poacher on a folded shield, while a healer checked his breathing and wrapped his bare foot in warmed wool. The leader stayed on his feet until Ilona looked at him and told him to sit. He was uninjured, he said. "You are blue around the mouth and wearing half a shirt in the Carpathians." He sat. A handler named Soren came back from the lower trail carrying the abandoned crossbow by its strap and set it beside the chains, the hooks, and one unbroken jar recovered from the snow. There were more traps below the western shoulder, he said. Copper line, goat fat, net mechanism. Charlie nodded. Mark them. Don't touch the salve barehanded. Soren glanced up the mountain and asked after the female. 3 eggs. Left foreleg cut by tightening wire. She's bearing weight now, but the wound needs cleaning. Charlie shifted as Ilona bound a wide strip of linen around his ribs. Nest floors braced badly, old ruins underneath. Enchantments unstable. Ilona pulled the binding tighter and his next word came out as a grunt. Good, she said, still able to make noise. 2 teams began readying for the climb, fitting dragon hide shields to wooden frames, loading smoked carcass meat onto the bait sledges, checking the brass valves on the cooling sprayers. Each handler carried a face veil, salve, and a hooked pole wrapped in white cloth so the dragon would see it clearly. Charlie watched them arrange themselves in pairs and told them to leave the red shields behind. They were the thickest, Soren said, frowning. She saw copper wire glowing red. Anything bright on the injured side will put her straight back on edge. The red shields were set aside. A young handler tightened the straps on a heavy iron muzzle and Charlie pointed at it. That stayed too. If she charges, she won't take a muzzle while brooding. She'll break her jaw against it or crush an egg turning away. He nodded towards the bait sledges. Open route east, feed sent low, shields on the western side only. Let her choose where to look. The young man unclipped the muzzle and set it down. Ilona finished binding Charlie's arm to his chest, then held up 3 fingers and asked how many. 3, he said. She folded one down and asked again. 2, good enough to be irritating. She closed the medical case and looked towards the climbing teams. You are not going back up. Charlie reached for his pack. Ilona put 1 boot on it. The nest is unstable, he said. So are you. She knows my scent. She also crushed your equipment and struck you with her tail. That was after I cut wire out of her leg. Ilona leaned closer. Charlie. He met her eyes, then looked at the handlers, preparing to enter the trees. Soren knew the feeding patterns of longhorns and had worked 2 relocations, and the others were steady, but none of them had stood inside that clutch circle or heard the strange rhythm beneath the eggs. Charlie unfastened the small pouch from his belt. Inside were the mooncalf powder, the empty salve vial, and the scrap of charred leather taken from the wound. He handed it to Soren. She has smelled all of this, he said. Keep it on your left side. Approach from the workshop wall, never the stair. There's a loose beam under the nearest egg, and the copper ring is holding more weight than it looks. Yeah. Soren took the pouch and asked about the hoard. Leave every piece where it is. The poacher leader raised his head from beside the ward stone. There was a ministry relay under the dragon's foreleg, he said. Charlie looked at him. I saw the rim, the man said. Old emergency work, worth more than most of the gold if it still functions. Soren's expression sharpened. A relay could call a warding crew. It could. Charlie went on picking a flake of dried salve from his glove. Then we retrieve it. No. Soren waited and Charlie let him wait, working the last of the salve loose before he bothered to explain. It's under the clutch ring. Pull it free and the nearest egg rolls towards the stair. We could brace first. You could, after she let 6 strangers rebuild her nest around her. The leader looked down at his bound hands and said Charlie had left it there. To that, Charlie said nothing at all. A gust came through the firs, carrying dragon smoke off the high basin, faint at this distance, threaded with snow and sulfur, and every reserve worker there knew it on the instant. The ponies stamped and hauled against their harness until the handlers covered their eyes. Ilona lifted her boot off Charlie's pack. He could go as far as the lower shelf, she told him, and no farther. He stood slowly and thanked her for the generosity. She was not finished. He would stay behind the shield line. Of course he would. He would not climb into the nest. Absolutely not. Then she gave Soren a flat look. If he does either of those things, hit him. With what? Something expensive. He respects equipment, and they went up in a long, careful file. Charlie took the rear beside Ilona, one arm bound, each breath kept shallow beneath the linen. Below them, the poachers stayed with the watch crew, sitting among the discarded chains while snow gathered over their empty packs. Higher on the ridge, the basin opened between the pines. The Longhorn lay across her eggs under the broken tower, one wing curved round the clutch, and beneath her chest, the ancient gold glimmered untouched, while smoke rose from her nostrils and streamed out across the open mountain. Below the basin, the handling team stopped and waited for the wind to turn. Soren knelt by a patch of bare stone, pinched ash between two fingers, and watched it drift east towards the black shelf. When the smoke from the Longhorn's nostrils drew the same line, he raised a hand and sent the western pair forward, shields low. Charlie stayed where he had been put, 3 paces behind the last frame. From there, the dragon looked almost settled, her head resting beside the copper ring, the injured foreclaw lying open on the hoard. But the tip of her tail moved whenever leather creaked or metal so much as touched stone. The first bait sledge went into the ruins along the route Charlie had used. Smoked mutton hung from the wooden hooks, heavy with blood and ash and the smell of the reserve feeding pens. Soren kept the scrap of charred leather tied at his left hip and walked beside the load without ever looking straight at the nest. The Longhorn lifted her head. Every handler stopped where they stood. She tasted the air with a slow draw through her nostrils, her gaze traveling from the meat to Soren's pouch, then past him to Charlie behind the shield line. The bronze eye held there a moment before it turned back to the sledge. "Forward 2 feet," Charlie said. Soren eased the load ahead. The runners scraped once over stone, and the dragon's throat vibrated, and after that no one moved until the sound had faded. Ilona stood beside Charlie with a hand hooked through the strap that bound his arm. "That counted as giving instructions," she murmured. I noticed. It did not count as behaving. The eastern team reached the black shelf and set the second carcass, where the dragon could see it beyond the ruins. Long poles opened the hide wrapping and let a stronger wave of feeding scent roll across the basin. The Longhorn shifted her weight towards it, testing the wounded leg before she moved the good foreclaw, and her body rose clear of the nest by inches. Soren slid the cooling sprayer forward and opened the brass valve. A soft blue mist spread low over the dragon's injured side, never near her eyes or her eggs. She flinched at the cold. Still, the familiar salve scent from the pouch held her attention long enough for the mist to settle into the wound. Charlie watched the swelling darken, then ease as the medicine took. The blood stopped running between the scales. Down went the foreclaw, and this time it bore more weight than before. Near the workshop, a handler pointed at the bracing beam. Its lower end had sunk into loosened mortar, and the copper ring was beginning to lean again. The nearest egg rested against the bent silver tray Charlie had wedged beneath it, secure for the moment, and not for much beyond it. Soren looked back. Charlie had already stepped around the shield. Ilona caught the rear of his coat. No. The beam goes before they can bring timber up from below. Then Soren handles it. He can't see the preserving mark under the joint. Soren glanced between them. I cannot. She let go of the coat with the look of someone setting a future argument carefully on a shelf. One hand, she said, no climbing. Charlie went into the ruins, bent slightly around his ribs. The Longhorn tracked him but did not rise. Her attention split between the bait and the figures around her nest. He came at her from the injured side, showing the empty hand she knew, keeping the bound arm tight against his chest. At the beam he knelt among the coins. The old preserving mark was almost lost under soot, a narrow loop cut into the timber where it met the wall. He cleared it with his thumb and pressed the tip of his wand into the groove. The beam straightened with a groan. Copper lifted beneath the egg, and Soren and two handlers slid a fresh ashwood brace into the gap, footing it on solid stone past the cracked treasury floor. They worked slowly, passing each tool hand to hand so that nothing clattered. Then the Longhorn leaned over Charlie. Heat pressed down across his neck. He could hear the wet movement inside her nostrils, the low grind of teeth held slightly apart, and one claw rested close enough to cover him shoulder to boot. He finished the preserving charm and drew his wand back. There, he said quietly. Better than it was? The dragon lowered her muzzle to his coat and sniffed. The dried blood, the blue salve, the smoky leather smell the handlers carried. Then her nose pushed against his bound shoulder, hard enough to rock him sideways. Behind the shields, Ilona pulled in a sharp breath. Charlie caught himself on the repaired brace. Bit heavy, he told the dragon, and she blew smoke through his hair. With the nest secured, the teams pulled back in the order they had come, shields last off the western wall, the bait sledges left out beyond the eastern shelf. The Longhorn followed the scent far enough to feed without letting the clutch out of her sight, tearing into the smoked carcass with slow, deliberate bites. From the workshop opening, Soren checked the repaired ring one more time. The Ministry distress relay stayed buried under shed scales and copper, its 7 needles silent beneath the dragon's foreleg, and around it lay the coins, the blue stone, the broken star wheel, and every other piece of the old settlement's treasure. No one touched any of it. By late afternoon, the handlers had withdrawn below the ward line. Ilona wrapped Charlie in a reserve blanket and made him drink something medicinal from a tin cup. It tasted of bark, of cloves, and of a punishment invented by committee. Soren sat on an overturned crate close by, writing the first incident report. What do I put for recovered property? Charlie checked one trouser pocket, then the other. A bent brass washer dropped into his palm, along with 2 pine needles and a piece of cold mutton fat. He tossed the washer into the evidence tray. That, Soren considered the single blackened circle of metal, The ministry will be impressed. They often are. Dusk came down over the Carpathians in long blue bands, turning the snowfields pale beneath the first stars. High above the trees, the Longhorn returned to the nest and folded herself over the eggs. Her horns showed dark against the broken tower, and the ancient gold beneath her gave back the last thin light out of the west. Charlie sat with his blanket round his shoulders, hair singed upright, cheeks stitched, ribs bound tight enough to make laughter unwise. He looked up as smoke drifted from the basin across the ridge. His pockets were empty when he grinned. Charlie never reported the hoard, and the reserve never entered it in any log. Some things are safer left where a dragon can sit on them. He came down off the mountain battered, empty-handed, and entirely content. Behind him the nest stayed warm, the gold stayed buried, and the only creature who knew the whole of it curled a little tighter and slept.